Okay, class, so I thought I would critique some of the examples that I have submitted by students on a specific and timely manner. I wanted to critique Sophia's work and just show you some good examples of where she's at. So this looks like her denotative approach for her recipe, ropa vieja. It looks like we have a certain level of hierarchy established with the title over here, the names of the ingredients, and then the recipe preparation. And then we have the list going on and the area of that contains our instructions, which is pretty good. One thing that I would like to recommend is if we're maintaining a certain grid on our layout like so, um, that we keep to that grid no matter what. So if we want to maintain that grid-like area, that we move that V closer to that invisible line that's being formed right here. And we want to make sure that preparation is also where that R is. That's where it starts. And then recipe should also start right where that is. So you don't need to stack your text in a centered layout. What I would recommend is bring it flush left, and all this information needs to be on the same line like so, which is what you've achieved here in the instructions. One thing I would recommend in this particular layout is we avoid leaving one word on the next line, so what we would call a widow. Same with oregano right here. So see if you can make this a little bit smaller, or if there are ways for you to shave down the text so that this word falls on the same sentence. So let's see if we can rework some of those types of areas on your layout. But I think overall this is a good first try for moving from the sketch to the computer. So I definitely wanted to take a look and see how we can fine-tune this a little bit more for the second round. I like what's going on with the connotative approach, especially with the type treatment that you've done over here. I think it looks great. And I think what's interesting about this is how you're using your layout in an interesting way. One thing I would recommend is you're already creating this sense of movement with your type, that you no longer need this rule or this line to give that sense of structure to your layout, because you're already achieving that with your text over here with the stacking effect. One thing I would also recommend is if you're looking at ingredients, we definitely want to make sure this is a little bit bolder or larger because it's reading like the rest of your information right here. So we need to establish a second level of hierarchy. So we don't have just two, like the title and the body copy. Let's also establish a third where the ingredients and the recipe over here, recipe preparation, have a little bit more prominence. Be it bold, be it a larger font copy or font or different font entirely. So let's just work a little bit more on this particular area of your poster and also see how this compares to the rest of your information, because these two elements sit next to each other on the page. I like what's going on with the movement of your ingredients list. I think something is kind of off when we have this really long line over here. See if we can kind of chop it down to the next line. And I would also say if there's a way for us to highlight the numbers differently than the rest of the text, that would be interesting. Could be maybe a lighter weight or maybe a bold weight, maybe more of a bolder weight. I'm not sure what's going on here. It looks like you wanted to create the same kind of line movement on this side of the page, but I'm seeing some kind of awkward movements here. So I'm wondering if there's a way to change that, or just to bring a little bit more structure, overall structure, to this side of the page. And I think you're in a very good area that you can move on to the second part of your assignment, which is just to tweak this a little bit more, and I think you'd be in a very good area for your connotative and your denotative. Let's move on to Andrei's work. Andrei's work, very good in terms of the first try. You definitely successfully had a good round with how you use the type, especially with scale. Now, one thing we want to take a look at is how much space you're looking at in between areas like this. You also want to take a look at whether or not we even need those rules in the first place. So if we can achieve this overall sense of division just with the text, I think that would be a lot more successful than us physically having to create an illustration. Because remember, this is not an illustration. What we're doing is we're doing the functional side of the typography, being the denotative. So I wanted to challenge you and say, what if some of those guides were to disappear and you only relied on your typography to create those divisions? And what I would recommend is, like you're doing here with scales, maybe you bring the scale up even more so that you have the placement of the Z on top and the Z on the bottom match the bottom part of your text right here. So you have an even amount of space between the two and you create some kind of balance between those two areas right here. And we also want to make sure that on the grill and the Z's right here and this information is still within the same category, right? And we also want to achieve this overall sense of scale with this particular part of the page, so we're not having to rely on those guides. I would say the same thing for your connotative. We definitely do not need to be illustrating anything on the page. I would rather this all be done typographically. Which is what I like about Sophia's work on her connotative, which is what she's doing with the text. And she is doing that successfully. So we definitely want to achieve this particular effect without the guides. So see if we can go into the next round and actually get rid of this illustration and just work with only the type. Okay? So that would be my feedback for you. This is Christian's work. This is Mexican Michelada. And it's interesting how you have done your denotative, and I definitely like where it's going. You're using color, and you're using those interesting effects for your type. Now, one thing I would say is to tone it down just a slight bit. I think it's great what you've done here and in some areas right here. Now I think where you really start to miss the readability part is over here. We're kind of not knowing what exactly we're reading here. So let's scale this down a tad bit by maybe removing this effect and just stick to straightforward text right here. You've already done quite a bit with the connotative approach with the title, subtitle, and the ingredients. So let's tone it down in this area right here and see if this works for areas of the ingredients, because we're also starting to lose a little bit of the readability here. I still would say you don't need those little areas right here. Those little corners, I don't think they're doing much to your information. If it's to make sure that they're well contained in these areas, I think you already are doing that without even having them. And let's make sure that the instructions is flipped and it's not upside down, just so we can read it a little bit better. For your denotative, I think it looks pretty good. I like how you're slicing the type onto the sides right here. I don't understand why we're putting instructions upside down, but I think in terms of how you're organizing your information on the page is nice. I would debate whether or not you need those circles. Let's see if we can create this division of type without those circles. So I would rather you do this effect typographically without you having to contain your text in specific shapes. And I think same goes for this rule right here, those guides that you're drawing in. You don't need them. So take those away, because I think what you're doing already with your text works well, that you don't need this. This is just decoration. this as well, all decoration. So let's get rid of that and see how we can work just with the type and the layout of the page. Okay, but I think overall this is a really good first step, and I really like the way in which we are using typography in a connotative approach right here. We just need to tone down just a few areas on the page, and I think we'll be in a good place. And then we get to Harold's work. Harold is doing the berry layer cake. And I think this is great in terms of how we're stacking our information, and we're creating a clear sense of hierarchy between the title, the ingredients, and then the step-by-step process. The next step I would recommend for you, Harold, is to take a look at some areas that can use some white space. So let's see if we can bring some white around the page. So I think we have a lot of text going on here. And let's see if we can bring some breathing room onto the page. And that way we can start to create a little bit more balance in the overall information. So it's nice that we have all the information on the page nicely stacked and aligned. But let's bring in some of that white space. And it could be just making things a little bit smaller, such as the numbers over here, and just looking a little bit more just breathing room in terms of readability, because it is a lot of information to take in. But I think in terms of how the information is organized is really nice, and it's pleasant to look at. And I definitely read layered cake just by looking at it, even though it's a denotative version. I think what you've done with your connotative is great. Just make sure that we're still able to read. I still would like to see the title clearly, if you can achieve that. And I think what's interesting here is how you've placed your text. However, it is hard to read. So I'm going to challenge you and say, is there a way for us to make this text readable by flipping it and going, horizontally instead of vertically? Because technically we want to read things horizontally as we're trained. Here it's a lot of different moves that are happening, and I know you're putting your cake on a specific angle, but keep in mind you still want your viewer to read your steps, your subtitles, your ingredients list. So I think what you're doing with illustrating your typographic connotative approach is good. Let's just bring in the readability part a bit more clear, also to your title, but I think this is a really good example of denotative and connotative. So good job, Harold. And I will see you guys in the next video.